When you click on a title about demonic serial killers, your mind inevitably drifts toward the faces that have been burned into our cultural consciousness. We think of the charming law student with the cast on his arm, smiling as he lured women into his Volkswagen Beetle. We think of the quiet man in Milwaukee, drilling holes into skulls in a desperate attempt to create living zombies. We think of the clown performing at children's birthday parties, burying bodies in the crawl space beneath his floorboards. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These names have become shorthand for monstrosity, synonyms for the darkest impulses of the human heart. We study them, we make documentaries about them, and in a strange, twisted way, we find comfort in them, because we know their names, we know their faces, we know their crimes were solved, their rampages ended, and justice, however delayed, was served. They are the monsters we keep in a glass cage, observing them from the safety of history, reassuring ourselves that evil like that is rare, that it is loud, and that eventually it is always caught. But that safety is a lie. It is a fragile construct built to keep us sleeping soundly at night, a shield we hold up against the terrifying reality of the world we live in. The truth is far more unsettling. The serial killers you know, the ones whose faces plaster the covers of true crime books and inspire Hollywood blockbusters, are merely the ones who failed. They are the ones who made mistakes, who got sloppy, who let their compulsion override their caution, or who simply wanted to be caught. They are the tip of the iceberg, visible above the dark, freezing water, but beneath the surface, lurking in the depths where the light of media attention never reaches, there exists a different breed of predator. These are the shadow killers. They are the phantoms who move through our world like smoke, leaving trails of devastation that span decades and cross borders, yet somehow remain invisible. They don't seek fame. They don't send taunting letters to the press. They don't want to be known. They only want to feed. And while the world obsesses over the monsters we caught, these individuals are out there right now, racking up victim counts that make Bundy and Dahmer look like amateurs. We are talking about killers with body counts in the triple digits, predators who treat murder not as a chaotic impulse, but as a lifelong career. Consider the staggering number of missing persons cases that go cold every single year. Thousands of people who simply vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. We tell ourselves they ran away. We tell ourselves they started new lives. But deep down, in the reptilian part of our brains that still fears the dark, we know better. We know that some of them met the shadow killers. These predators operate in the blind spots of society. They hunt the vulnerable, the marginalized, the people society has already decided don't matter. They exploit the cracks in law enforcement, moving from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, turning the vast highways and byways of the world into their personal hunting grounds. They are the truck drivers, the transient workers, the drifters who have perfected the art of being unremarkable. They are the neighbors who wave to you in the morning, the faces you pass in the grocery aisle without a second glance, completely unaware that behind their eyes lies a darkness so profound it defies comprehension. But in this documentary, we aren't just looking for high numbers. We are looking for something specific. We are looking for the truly demonic. And when we use that word, we don't mean it in the theological sense. We mean a specific psychological profile that separates a murderer from a monster. To be classified as demonic in this context, a killer must exhibit a level of ritualistic cruelty that suggests they aren't just killing for convenience or rage, but for pleasure. They are deriving sustenance from the suffering of others. We are looking at the lack of remorse so absolute it suggests a void where a human soul should be. These are individuals who can look into the eyes of a pleading victim and feel nothing but contempt. They can extinguish a life as easily as you would blow out a candle, and then go home and eat dinner with their families as if nothing happened. And perhaps most disturbingly, we are looking at near supernatural evasion, the uncanny ability to slip through the fingers of justice time and time again. The killers who were interviewed by police and let go, the ones who were arrested and released, the ones who seem to be protected by some dark fortune that allows them to continue their work while the world remains oblivious. We are about to descend into the abyss. We are going to examine cases that will make you question the nature of humanity. We will walk through the crime scenes that seasoned detectives couldn't scrub from their memories. We will hear the whispers of the victims who were silenced too soon. These are not the stories you have heard 1,000 times before. You won't find Hollywood heartthrobs playing these killers in Netflix dramas. These are the stories that were buried, the files that collected dust in basement archives, the nightmares that were too real, too raw, and too disturbing for the morning news. We are going to peel back the layers of normalcy that protect our daily lives and expose the rot underneath. We are going to look into the eyes of men who walked among us unnoticed, while harboring secrets that would make the devil himself blush. We are going to shatter the illusion that you are safe, that the police always catch the bad guy, and that monsters are easy to spot. Because the scariest thing isn't the monster under the bed. It's the monster standing next to you in the elevator, smiling politely, while his mind replays the sound of his last victim's final breath. So, lock your doors, check your windows, turn on the lights, because once you hear these stories, you might never look at a stranger the same way again. We are about to shine a light into the darkest corners of human psychology, and what we find there might change you forever. But before we step into the darkness, I have one request. If you enjoy this kind of videos, subscribe for more content like this. Now, let's begin. The Andes Mountains are breathtaking. They are a jagged spine of rock and ice that cuts through the heart of South America, a place of ancient history, sweeping vistas, and thin, cold air. But for the people living in the remote villages and bustling market towns of Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia during the 1970s, the mountains weren't just a place of beauty. They were a hiding place. They were a vast, rugged landscape that could swallow a person whole without leaving a trace. And moving through those mountain passes, drifting like a ghost between borders, was a man who would turn that landscape into a graveyard. We often think of serial killers as anomalies, rare glitches in the human code. We think of them operating in the shadows of major cities, hunting in the dark alleys of London or the highways of California. But what happens when a predator operates in a world where people are already disappearing? What happens when he targets the poorest of the poor, the children whose families have no power, no voice, and no way to command the attention of the authorities? You get a monster who operates with absolute impunity. You get a body count that doesn't just shock the conscience, it breaks it. This is the story of Pedro Alonso Lopez, a man whose name might not be as instantly recognizable as Bundy or Dahmer, but whose crimes make them look like amateurs. They called him the Monster of the Andes, and once you hear his story, you will understand why that name isn't just a nickname. It is a warning. Because the most terrifying part of this story isn't just what he did. It's that after confessing to murdering over 300 young girls, the system that was supposed to punish him simply let him go. To understand how a human being becomes a monster of this magnitude, you have to look at where he came from. Pedro Lopez was born in Colombia in 1948. during a period known simply as La Violencia. It was a time of civil war, brutality, and social collapse. The country was drowning in blood, and Pedro was born right into the tide. His mother was a prostitute who had 13 children, and Pedro was just another mouth to feed in a world that had no food to give. When he was just 8 years old, his mother kicked him out, not because he had done something terrible, but because she caught him fondling his younger sister. She threw him onto the streets of Colombia, a child alone in a violent world, and the streets did what the streets always do to vulnerable children. They ate him alive. He was abused, beaten, and starved. A man picked him up, seemingly to help him, but instead took him to an abandoned house and sexually assaulted him. This was Pedro's introduction to the world of adults. Pain, dominance, and violation. By the time he was a teenager, the boy who had been victimized had begun to harden. He drifted across the country, surviving on scraps, learning that the only currency that mattered was power. In 1969, he found himself in prison for car theft, and it was there, inside the brutal, lawless walls of a Colombian prison, that the final transformation took place. He was gang raped by 4 inmates. It was a savage, dehumanizing attack. But Pedro didn't just survive it. He waited, he plotted, and one by one he killed 3 of the men who had attacked him. When he was released, he wasn't just a car thief anymore. He was a killer. He had crossed that invisible line that separates the angry from the murderous, and he found that he liked it. But his rage wasn't directed at men. It wasn't directed at the people who had hurt him in prison. It was directed at something much more specific, much more vulnerable. He hated the purity he had lost. He hated the innocence he never got to have. And so, he decided to destroy it wherever he found it. He began to wander. He moved through the high Andean nations, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, like a plague. He didn't have a home. He didn't have a job. He had a mission. He would enter a town, usually a bustling market center, where indigenous families would come from the mountains to sell their goods. These markets are chaotic, colorful, crowded places. It's easy to get lost. It's easy to get separated. And it is incredibly easy for a predator to spot a child who has strayed just a few feet too far from her mother. His method was simple, almost primitive, but devastatingly effective. He would spot a young girl, usually between the ages of 9 and 12. He liked that age. Old enough to be aware, young enough to be easily manipulated. He would approach them with a charm that seemed impossible for a man of his appearance. He was disheveled, often dirty, looking like just another drifter. But he had a way with words, a soft-spoken confidence that disarmed them. He would offer them trinkets, small toys, or a few coins. Sometimes he would pretend to be a simpleton who needed help carrying a package. Imagine the scene. A young girl, maybe bored while her mother haggles over the price of potatoes, sees a man who offers her a shiny bauble. It's a moment of wonder, a distraction. She takes a step toward him, then another, and within seconds, he has led her away from the safety of the crowd, out of the market, and into the vast, empty wilderness that surrounds these towns. Once he had them alone, the mask fell away. The charm evaporated, replaced by the savage brutality he had learned in the streets and prisons of his youth. He would rape them, he would torture them, and then he would strangle them. He looked into their eyes as the light went out, taking a twisted satisfaction in extinguishing the future they should have had. And when he was done, he would leave their bodies in the brush, or bury them in shallow graves, and walk back into the mountains, bouncing to the next town, the next market, the next victim. This went on for years, years. In Peru alone, he claimed to have killed 100 girls, 100 families destroyed, 100 empty beds. And because these victims were poor, because they were indigenous, because they lived in remote areas where police resources were scarce and record keeping was practically non-existent, no one connected the dots. The police in one village didn't talk to the police in the next. The disappearances were treated as tragedies, not crimes. Girls ran away, they said. They got lost in the mountains. They fell into rivers. But Pedro knew. He kept count. He moved north into Ecuador, finding the country to his liking. "I like the girls in Ecuador," he would later say with chilling casualness. "They are more gentle, more trusting, more innocent." He set up his hunting grounds in the valley around Ambato. This was a rich agricultural area, full of life, full of markets, full of targets. He operated there with a terrifying efficiency. He would kill 3, sometimes 4 girls a week. Let that sink in. 3 or 4 human lives extinguished every single week. While the local police were filing reports and shrugging their shoulders, Pedro Lopez was conducting a genocide in slow motion. He felt untouchable. He felt like a god. He believed that the mountains belonged to him, that the girls belonged to him, that he was simply taking what the world owed him. It wasn't brilliant detective work that caught him. It wasn't a task force or a manhunt or a sophisticated forensic breakthrough. It was a fluke. It was sheer dumb luck. In 1980, he was in a market in Ambato, doing what he always did. He was leading a young girl away, whispering promises, guiding her toward her death. But this time, the girl's mother saw them. She didn't just call out. She ran. She screamed. The market crowd, protective and fierce, surrounded him. They were ready to tear him apart right there in the street. In these communities, justice is often swift and physical. They knew what he was trying to do. They recognized the predator in their midst. But a police patrol intervened. They arrested Lopez, not for murder, but for attempted abduction. They saved him from the mob, unaware that they had just taken the most prolific serial killer in history into custody. At the police station, Lopez was arrogant. He was calm. He looked at the officers with contempt. To them, he was just a dirty drifter who had tried to grab a kid. To him, they were insects. He decided, in that interrogation room, to show them exactly who they were dealing with. He didn't lawyer up. He didn't deny it. He started to talk. And once he started, he couldn't stop. He told them about the girl in the market. Then, he told them about the 3 girls the week before. Then he told them about the ones in the month before that. The police didn't believe him. It was too much. It was too grotesque. No one man could do this. They thought he was crazy, a delusional vagrant making up stories to get attention or to build a reputation. "You don't believe me?" Lopez sneered. "I can prove it." He led them out into the fields surrounding Ambato. He took them to a specific hillside, a place where the earth looked disturbed. He told them to dig, and they did. They found the remains of a young girl, then another, then another. In a single field, they found the bodies of 53 girls. The police were stunned into silence. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. But Lopez was just getting started. He told them that was just a fraction. He told them about his time in Peru. He told them about Colombia. He claimed to have killed 110 girls in Peru, 100 in Colombia, and over 100 in Ecuador. More than 300 victims, 300 lives. Then, nature itself seemed to vomit up the evidence. A flash flood hit the region shortly after his arrest, eroding the banks of a dry riverbed near where Lopez had confessed to burying more bodies. When the waters receded, the villagers were met with a nightmare. Skulls, femurs, ribs, The remains of dozens of children were exposed to the sunlight. The earth could no longer hold his secrets. Journalist Ron Leitner interviewed Lopez in his cell in Ambato. He described a man who was utterly devoid of remorse. Lopez didn't speak of his victims as people. He spoke of them as objects, as numbers. He described the moment of death with a terrifying intimacy, recounting the look in their eyes, the feeling of their struggle. He called himself the monster of the Andes, embracing the title the press had given him. He was proud of it. "I lost my innocence at age 8, he told Lena, "so I decided to take theirs." It was a statement of pure, distilled nihilism. He viewed his actions as a cosmic balancing of the scales. The world had hurt him, so he would hurt the world. But his logic was flawed, twisted by a psychopathy that allowed him to view the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl as a justifiable act of revenge against the universe. The people of Ecuador were horrified. The mothers who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters finally had an answer, but it was an answer that brought no peace, only a deeper, sharper pain. They wanted him dead. They wanted him to suffer. They wanted justice that matched the magnitude of his crimes. But here is where the story shifts from a tragedy to an outrage. In 1980, the legal system in Ecuador was not equipped to deal with a monster like Pedro Alonso Lopez. The laws were written for thieves, for brawlers, perhaps for the occasional crime of passion. They were not written for a man who had depopulated entire villages. There was no death penalty in Ecuador. There was no life imprisonment without parole. The maximum sentence, the absolute most the state could do to a person, no matter what they had done, was 16 years. 16 years. Do the math. Lopez confessed to over 300 murders. Even if you only count the 53 bodies they physically dug up in that one field, or the 110 confirmed by authorities across the 3 countries, a 16-year sentence is an insult. It works out to a few weeks in prison for every child he tortured and killed. It meant that his debt to society for stealing a human life was roughly equivalent to a long vacation. He was sentenced to the maximum. He went to prison, and inside, he was a celebrity. He gave interviews. He taunted the guards. He lived with the knowledge that he had beaten the system. He knew the calendar was turning. He knew that every day he sat in his cell was one day closer to the gate opening. During his imprisonment, he was interviewed again. He expressed no regret. In fact, he expressed the opposite. He said that when he was released, he would do it again. He said he was a missionary of death, that he was doing these girls a favor by removing them from a life of poverty. It was the self-serving delusion of a psychopath, but it was a delusion he held onto with iron conviction. And then the impossible happened. In 1994, 2 years early, Pedro Alonso Lopez was released from prison. Why? Good behavior. The man who had murdered 300 children, who had vowed to kill again, who had shown zero remorse, was released for good behavior. The bureaucracy of the prison system looked at his file, saw that he hadn't stabbed a guard or started a riot recently, and decided he was fit to walk free. He was deported to Colombia, but in Colombia, he was a free man. The crimes he had committed there decades earlier were difficult to prosecute. The evidence was old, the witnesses were gone, and the legal hurdles were immense. He was processed, he was evaluated, and he was released into the streets of Bogotá. The monster of the Andes was back in the wild. The public outcry was deafening, but it was too late. He had slipped through the cracks of a fractured legal system, aided by incompetence, indifference, and a law that simply couldn't comprehend the scale of his evil. In 2002, a new warrant was issued for his arrest in Colombia, linked to a fresh murder case. A young girl had been found dead, killed in a manner that bore all the signatures of the monster. The authorities went to look for him. They went to his last known address. They checked the shelters, the streets, the places a drifter might hide. They found nothing. Pedro Alonso Lopez had vanished. He had dissolved back into the landscape that created him. For over 20 years, he has been a ghost. There have been sightings, whispers, rumors of an old man wandering the markets in the border towns, watching the children, offering trinkets. But he has never been caught. Interpol has him listed as one of the most wanted men in the world. But a red notice on a website doesn't stop a monster. It doesn't protect a child walking home from school in a remote Andean village. The terrifying reality is that Pedro Alonso Lopez, the man who killed more people than almost any other serial killer in recorded history, is likely still out there. Or maybe he died alone in a ditch, unmourned and unnamed. We don't know. And that uncertainty is his final act of torture. He proved that if you pick the right victims, if you move across the right borders, and if you exploit the right loopholes, you can commit the worst crimes imaginable and walk away. He proved that sometimes the monster doesn't just get away with it. Sometimes the monster wins. But if you think the mountains of South America are the only place where evil hides behind a friendly face, you're wrong. Sometimes the danger isn't a drifter in a dirty coat. Sometimes it's the person you trust the most, the person you invite into your home, the person who stands beside you at a barbecue, flipping burgers while his basement hides secrets that would make your blood run cold. Because thousands of miles away, in a quiet suburb where no one locked their doors, another man was building his own private graveyard, right under the feet of his family. Spring break, South Padre Island, Texas. It is a ritual as old as the American university system itself. Every year, thousands of students flock to the border, trading textbooks for tequila, exam stress for sunburns, and the rigid structure of academic life for a week of absolute unbridled chaos. It is a time of excess, of loud music thumping against the sand, of inhibitions lowered by the heat and the alcohol. For most, it is a hazy memory they will laugh about at reunions 10 years down the line. A story about a hangover, a bad sunburn, a foolish romance. But for a 21-year-old pre-med student named Mark Kilroy, Spring Break 1989 wasn't the beginning of a memory. It was the end of everything. Mark was the kind of young man that parents dream of raising. Athletic, intelligent, driven, with a smile that seemed to promise a bright future as a doctor. He had his whole life mapped out in front of him, a straight line from university to medical school to a comfortable life saving others. On March 14, 1989, he and his friends decided to cross the border into Matamoros, Mexico. It was a common excursion, a rite of passage for students looking for cheaper drinks and a looser atmosphere. The night was festive, filled with the chaotic energy of thousands of young people moving between bars, the air thick with humidity and the smell of street food. As the night wound down and the early hours of the morning began to creep in, Mark and his friends made their way back toward the international bridge to cross back into the safety of the United States. The line at the border was long, a snake of tired, intoxicated students shuffling toward the checkpoint. In the crush of the crowd, Mark stepped away for just a moment. Maybe to find a bathroom, maybe to get some air. His friends assumed he was right behind them. They crossed the bridge, waiting for him on the other side. They waited for minutes that turned into hours. But Mark Kilroy never came across. He had simply vanished into the neon-lit darkness of Matamoros. The disappearance of an American student on the border usually triggers a frantic search. But in 1989, The initial reaction was slow. Kids wander off during spring break all the time. They pass out in hotels, they meet girls, they lose track of time. But Mark's parents knew better. They knew their son. He wasn't irresponsible. He wasn't the type to just disappear. As days turned into weeks, the panic began to set in. Flyers with Mark's face were plastered on every telephone pole from Brownsville to Matamoros. The US government put pressure on Mexican authorities. Customs agents were on high alert. But despite the manhunt, despite the rewards, despite the desperate pleas of a family watching their worst nightmare unfold in slow motion, there was nothing. No ransom note, no body, no witnesses. Mark Kilroy had stepped off the edge of the earth, but he hadn't left the earth, not yet. He had been taken, and he hadn't been taken for money or for political leverage or because of a drug deal gone wrong. He had been taken because of something far more ancient and far more terrifying. He had been taken because a man named Adolfo Constanzo needed a brain. To understand the hell that Mark Kilroy walked into, you have to understand that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who want to hurt you because they hate you. They are the ones who want to hurt you because they believe it is necessary. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born in Miami in 1962 to a Cuban teenage mother. From the very beginning, his life was steeped in the occult. His mother was a practitioner of Santeria, and later Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Caribbean religion that, in its traditional form, honors spirits and ancestors. But in the hands of Adolfo Constanzo, it would be twisted into something unrecognizable, something malignant. Constanzo was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a magnetic personality that drew people to him. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a model. But beneath the surface, he was a predator who had learned early on that belief is the most powerful weapon on earth. He moved to Mexico City and began to offer his services as a spiritual guide to the drug cartels. The cartels were superstitious. They lived lives of extreme violence and constant danger, always waiting for the bullet with their name on it. Constanzo offered them something money couldn't buy. He offered them invincibility. He told them that through his rituals, through his connection to the spirits, he could make them invisible to the police. He could make them bulletproof. He could ensure that their shipments of cocaine and marijuana would cross the border untouched. And the terrifying part is, it seemed to work. The traffickers he worked with saw their profits soar. They evaded capture time and time again. Constanzo's reputation grew. He became El Padrino, the godfather. He wasn't just a witch doctor to them. He was a messiah of the underworld, but his protection came with a price. The spirits, he told them, were hungry. They demanded payment in blood. At first it was animals, goats, chickens, snakes. But as Constanzo's power grew, so did his ego, and so did the appetite of his gods. The rituals needed to be stronger. The magic needed to be more potent. And for that, he needed something with a soul. He needed human beings. This brings us back to Matamoros, to a dusty, desolate place called Rancho Santa Elena. This was the headquarters of the Hernandez drug smuggling family, and it was here that Constanzo had set up his temple. By April 1989, a month after Mark Kilroy vanished, the police were no closer to finding him. The break in the case didn't come from good detective work or forensic science. It came from the very thing Constanzo promised to prevent: visibility. On April 1st, 1989, a red pickup truck drove through a police checkpoint near Matamoros. The driver, a young man named Serafin Hernandez, drove right past the officers without stopping, looking at them with an eerie calmness. When the police chased him down and cornered him, he didn't seem afraid. He seemed confused. He asked the officers, genuinely puzzled, "Why can you see me?" He had been wearing a magical amulet given to him by Constanzo. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was invisible. This arrest led police to Rancho Santa Elena. They were looking for drugs. They expected to find marijuana, maybe some cocaine, perhaps a stash of weapons. And they did find those things. But they also found a shed, a shack with a tin roof that smelled of death long before they opened the door. The air around it was heavy with flies, buzzing in a thick black cloud. When the officers stepped inside that shed, they walked into a scene that would permanently scar even the most hardened veterans of the Mexican police force. It was a slaughterhouse of the soul. The room was filled with candles, cigars, bottles of cheap rum, and machetes crusted with dried blood. But the centerpiece of the room, the object that drew the eye and turned the stomach, was a large iron cauldron, the nganga. In the twisted theology of Adolfo Constanzo, the nganga was the source of all power. It was a vessel that housed the spirit. And to keep the spirit happy, to keep the protection flowing, the cauldron had to be fed. Inside the pot, investigators found a nightmare stew, a thick, coagulated soup of blood, animal carcasses, spiders, scorpions, and wooden sticks. But as they sifted through the contents, the horror deepened. They found human bones. They found a human brain. The police forced the captured cartel members, the followers of Constanzo, to dig. They pointed to spots in the dry earth surrounding the shed. "Here," they said, "and here, and here." As the shovels broke the ground, the smell of decomposition rose up to meet them. One by one, the bodies were pulled from the earth. 12 of them. 12 human beings who had been mutilated, tortured, and sacrificed to feed the ego of a madman. And among them was Mark Kilroy. The details of Mark's death are difficult to hear, but they are necessary to understand the depth of the evil that was operating just across the border. Constanzo had ordered his men to find him a specific type of victim. He wanted an Anglo, a smart student, someone with a good brain. He believed that by sacrificing someone intelligent, the Nganga would grant his cult superior intelligence the ability to outsmart the police and the rival cartels. Mark Kilroy wasn't chosen at random. He was chosen for his potential, and that potential was stolen from him in the most brutal way imaginable. He had been taken to the ranch, tortured, and then killed with a machete blow to the back of the neck. His brain had been removed and placed in the cauldron. His spine had been cut out to be made into a necklace for Constanzo's lieutenant. It was a level of savagery that seemed to belong to the Dark Ages, not 1989. It was ritualistic, methodical, and completely devoid of empathy. To Constanzo, Mark wasn't a person. He was a battery, a component in a spell. The discovery of the bodies at Rancho Santa Elena sent shockwaves through both Mexico and the United States. The media dubbed them the Narco-Satanists. The public was horrified. How could this happen? How could a cult like this operate in the shadows? And where was the leader? Because Adolfo Constanzo wasn't at the ranch. He had slipped away, vanishing just as he had promised his followers he could. With him was Sara Aldrete. The media would call her La Madrina, the godmother. Sara was an enigma, tall, beautiful, a student at Texas Southmost College across the border in Brownsville. To her friends and professors, she was a normal, high-achieving student on the dean's list. She played soccer. She had a boyfriend. But by night, she was the high priestess of a death cult, stirring the cauldron, witnessing the torture, and recruiting innocent men to their deaths. The duality of her life is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. How does someone sit in a classroom discussing sociology or literature in the morning and then stand over a pot of human blood in the evening? It speaks to a compartmentalization that borders on the inhuman. The manhunt for Constanzo and his inner circle shifted to Mexico City. The police were desperate. They knew they were dealing with a man who had no limits, a man who believed he was a god. Constanzo, meanwhile, was unraveling. The invisibility shield had broken. The police had found his sanctuary. His magic was failing. But rather than surrender, rather than face the justice of the legal system, he descended further into madness. He was hiding in an apartment building in the Cuauhtemoc district of Mexico City. He had his remaining followers with him, including Sarah Aldrete. He was paranoid, agitated, convinced that his enemies were closing in from all sides. And they were. On May 6, 1989, police located the apartment. The agents surrounded the building, weapons drawn, ready for a siege. What happened next was a bizarre final act in a tragedy that had already defied all logic. From the window of the apartment, Constanzo began throwing money onto the street below. Thousands of dollars in cash, raining down like confetti. It was a gesture of contempt, a final mockery of the world he was leaving behind. He was shouting at the police, taunting them, telling them they would never take him alive. Inside the apartment, the tension broke. Constanzo knew it was over, but he wasn't going to let the police have the satisfaction of putting him in handcuffs. He wasn't going to let them parade him in front of the cameras as a captured criminal. He was El Padrino, he decided when he died. He handed a machine gun to one of his followers, a man named Alvaro de Leon, whom he called El Dubi. He gave him an order: kill me. El Dubi hesitated. This was his leader, his god. But Constanzo insisted. He demanded it. In that sweltering apartment, surrounded by the sirens of the police and the inevitable end of his dark reign, Constanzo stood before his follower and waited. El Dubi raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. A hail of bullets tore through Adolfo Constanzo and his lover, Martin Quintana. They fell together, dead before they hit the floor. When the police stormed the apartment moments later, they found the bodies. The man who had terrorized the border, who had ordered the deaths of at least 15 people, though some suspect the number is much higher, was gone. He had escaped judgment in this life, taking the easy way out, leaving behind a legacy of pain that would never truly heal. Sarah Aldrete was captured alive. She claimed she was a victim, that she had been held against her will, that she was terrified of Constanzo and had no choice but to participate. But the evidence told a different story. The photos, the testimony of other cult members, the sheer length of time she had been by his side, it all pointed to a willing participant, a woman who had tasted the power Constanzo offered and found it intoxicating. She was sentenced to more than 60 years in prison, where she remains to this day, a living ghost of a nightmare that most people want to forget. The story of the Narco-Satanists is more than just a tale of drugs and murder. It is a terrifying glimpse into the fragility of the human mind. We like to think that we are rational creatures, that we live in a world governed by logic and science. But Adolfo Constanzo proved that if you scratch the surface, the old fears, the old superstitions, are still there, waiting to be exploited. He convinced grown men, hardened criminals, that he could bend the laws of physics with a pot of blood and bones. He convinced a college honor student that torture was spiritual, and he proved that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a handsome man in a suit, promising you that he can make all your problems go away if you're just willing to pay the price. The cult was dismantled, the ranch was burned, and the Nganga was destroyed. But the scars on Matamoros and Brownsville remain. The family of Mark Kilroy had to bury their son in pieces, a tragedy no parent should ever endure. They started a foundation in his name, trying to bring something good out of the unspeakable darkness that consumed him. They fought to ensure that Mark would be remembered for how he lived, not just for how he died, but for the detectives who walked into that shed, for the locals who lived in the shadow of Rancho Santa Elena. The memory of what they saw in that cauldron never really faded. It's a reminder that civilization is a thin veneer, and beneath it, there are people willing to believe anything, willing to do anything, to feel powerful. The smoke from the burning shed at Rancho Santa Elena eventually cleared, drifting into the Mexican sky. The horror of the Narco-Satanists was laid to rest in the history books and the cold case files. But while the world was staring in disbelief at the border, wondering how such a primitive brutality could exist in the modern age, another predator was already at work. This one didn't need a cauldron. He didn't need a cult or a complex theology of blood sacrifice. He didn't need to hide in the desert or rely on the superstition of drug runners. He was operating in the most public place imaginable, a place of bright lights, crowds, and cameras, a place where dreams are made and broken every single day. He was a photographer, a man whose job was to capture beauty, to frame the perfect shot. But behind the lens, his eye wasn't looking for glamour. It was looking for the moment the light went out. Because for Rodney Alcala, the camera wasn't just a tool for art. It was a hunting weapon. And he was about to use it to charm his way into the lives of women who thought they were stepping into a photo shoot, only to find themselves the subject of a masterpiece of death. In the deep, humid darkness of the Louisiana bayou, where the moss hangs heavy from the cypress trees and the air is thick enough to choke on, silence is never really silence. The nights are filled with the drone of cicadas, the splash of gators, and the rustling of things moving unseen in the undergrowth. In the early 20th century, specifically between 1911 and 1912, that darkness held something far more terrifying than the natural predators of the swamp. It held a presence that didn't just kill, it obliterated. It wiped out entire bloodlines in a single night, leaving behind scenes of carnage so gruesome that even hardened lawmen, men who had seen the worst of humanity, fell to their knees and wept. This wasn't just murder, it was ritual, it was sacrifice. And for the longest time, the people of Lafayette believed they were hunting a monster, a man of immense strength and savage brutality. They had no idea that the face of their nightmare belonged to a teenage girl who believed she had found the secret to eternal life. The story begins not with a whisper, but with a slaughter. It was the dead of winter, January 1911, in the quiet town of Rayne, Louisiana. The Byers family, a husband, a wife, and their young son, went to sleep in their modest home, likely worrying about the harvest, the weather, or the mundane struggles of life in the segregated South. They locked their doors, they blew out the lamps, they drifted into the vulnerability of sleep, trusting that the walls of their home would protect them. But trust, in this case, was a fatal mistake. Sometime in the darkest hour of the night, an intruder slipped into the house. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, just a silent shadow moving through the rooms. The weapon of choice wasn't a gun or a knife, but an axe, a heavy, brutal tool meant for splitting wood, now repurposed for splitting skulls. When the sun rose and the neighbors realized the Byers' house was too quiet, they went to investigate. What they found inside defied explanation. The family hadn't just been killed, they had been butchered. The violence was frenzied, overkill in the truest sense of the word. But amidst the gore, there was a strange, chilling detail that suggested this wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of rage. The bodies were positioned. The blood seemed to paint a picture that no one could quite decipher. And the killer? They had vanished into the morning mist, leaving no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing but the heavy, metallic scent of death. The police were baffled. In 1911, forensics was in its infancy. They looked for a motive, money, revenge, a lover's quarrel, but found nothing. The buyers were ordinary people. Who would want to exterminate them with such biblical fury? Before the town could even process the grief, before the soil had settled on the buyers' graves, the darkness struck again. Just a month later, in February, the Andrus family in Lafayette was targeted. Alexander Andrus, his wife, and their 2 children. The scene was a carbon copy of the horror in Rain. The entry was silent. The weapon was an axe. The victims were asleep. And once again, the violence was absolute. An entire family unit extinguished in moments. The panic that gripped the community was visceral. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a predator. A serial killer was hunting in their midst, and his appetite seemed insatiable. But there was another pattern emerging, one that made the terror even more specific. The killer was targeting mixed-race families, specifically those of African and European descent, known then as mulatto families. The fear was palpable. People stopped sleeping. Fathers sat on porches with shotguns across their laps, staring into the tree lines, waiting for a twig to snap. Families huddled together in single rooms, barricading doors with furniture, praying that the sun would rise before the axe fell. The newspapers began to circulate theories, whipping the public into a frenzy. Was it a maniac? A drifter? A supernatural force? The police were under immense pressure to make an arrest, to provide a face for the boogeyman so the town could kill it and go back to sleep. And in their desperation, they found a suspect. Raymond Barnabé was a local sharecropper, a man with a rough reputation and a temper to match. He fit the profile the police had constructed, strong, capable of violence, and living on the fringes. He was arrested and charged with the murders of the Andrus family. The evidence was circumstantial at best, built on whispers and the desperate need for a scapegoat. But the final nail in Raymond's coffin came from his own blood. His teenage daughter, Clementine Barnabé, and her brother Zephyrin took the stand against him. Clementine, young and seemingly innocent, testified with a cold clarity. She painted her father as a monster, a brute who had returned home on the nights of the murders with blood on his clothes and a wild look in his eyes. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was in a cage. Raymond Barnabé was convicted, sentenced, and locked away. The shotgun vigils ended. The barricades came down. Life, they thought, could return to normal. But evil is rarely so easily contained, and the truth has a nasty habit of bleeding through the cracks. While Raymond sat in his cell, waiting for the hangman or the rest of his life in chains, the axe swung again. In November 1911, in Lafayette, Norbert and Nassima Randall and their 4 children were murdered. The method was identical. The axe, the sleeping victims, the absolute carnage, the specific targeting of a mixed-race family. The news hit the community like a physical blow. How could this be? The killer was supposed to be in jail. Raymond Barnabé couldn't have killed the Randalls. He was behind bars. The realization washed over the town with the force of a tidal wave. they had the wrong man. Or at the very least, Raymond wasn't working alone. The monster was still out there, free, emboldened, and mocking them with every swing of the blade. The police were back to square one. But this time, the lens of suspicion shifted. They began to look closer at the Barnabet family, specifically at the young girl who had so eagerly testified against her father. Clementine Barnabet. On the surface, she was just a teenager, a girl attending church, living a quiet life. But neighbors began to whisper about her behavior. They talked about her strange intensity, her mood swings, her fascination with the macabre. And then, a crucial piece of evidence surfaced. Blood. Investigators found blood on Clementine's clothes. Not a smear, not a drop, but enough to suggest she had been close to violence. When they questioned her, she claimed it was menstrual blood, a taboo subject that she likely hoped would make the male investigators back off. But they didn't. They pressed her. They dug deeper. And as they pulled at the threads of her story, the innocent facade began to unravel. Clementine was arrested, initially just as a suspect, perhaps an accomplice. No one, not even the most cynical detective, was ready for what she would eventually reveal. At first, Clementine played the victim. She was confused, she was scared, she didn't know anything. But as the days in the cell turned into weeks, something in her shifted. The scared little girl vanished, replaced by a persona that was arrogant, proud, and deeply, terrifyingly committed to a cause no one else could see. She began to talk, and once she started, she didn't stop. She didn't just confess to the murders, she boasted about them. She described the feeling of the axe in her hands, the sound of it striking bone, the rush of power that surged through her as she stood over the sleeping bodies of her victims. But Clementine wasn't a lone wolf. That was the detail that turned this case from a standard serial killer investigation into something out of a gothic horror novel. She claimed she wasn't acting alone. She was part of a group, a cult she called the Church of Sacrifice. This wasn't just about killing, it was about theology. It was a twisted, bastardized version of religion that blended elements of Christianity with what the press at the time sensationalized as voodoo or hoodoo, though practitioners of those actual faiths would recoil at the association. Clementine spoke of a sacrifice church, where the ultimate offering to God wasn't prayer or fasting, but human life. She told investigators that she and her followers believed that by killing, they could obtain immortality. They believed that the sacrifice of sinners, which in their warped view meant these specific families, would grant them supernatural protection and eternal youth. She claimed to have a voodoo charm, a bag given to her by a root doctor that made her invisible to the police and protected her from the consequences of her actions. For a long time, it seemed to work. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil because she was the evil. The details she provided were chillingly specific. She talked about caressing the victims before killing them, ensuring they were in a deep sleep. She described the way she and her accomplices, men she named as the Human Five, would travel from town to town, using the railroad tracks as their highway of death. They were a mobile slaughterhouse, moving through the night, striking in rain, in Lafayette, in Lake Charles, leaving a trail of bodies stretching across the state. The press went wild. They dubbed her the voodoo priestess, the axe girl, the demon of the bayou. The headlines were lurid, screaming about black magic and ritual sacrifice. But beneath the sensationalism was a cold, hard reality. A teenage girl had orchestrated the deaths of at least 17 people. though some estimates based on her confessions and the similar crimes in the region put the number as high as 35. 35 human beings. Men, women, children. Entire generations wiped out because a charismatic, delusional leader convinced her followers that murder was the key to heaven. Clementine's confession was a performance. She recounted the murders with a smile, laughing at the memory of the victims' last breaths. She described killing the Randall children with a detachment that made the seasoned lawmen sick to their stomachs. She said she killed the children because she didn't want them to grow up orphans. In her twisted logic, that was mercy. The axe was an instrument of salvation. The human 5 she named were real men, members of her congregation, people who had fallen under her spell. But even as arrests were made and the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Clementine remained the center of gravity. She was the queen bee, the high priestess of the axe. She claimed that she had been given the power to kill by a spirit, a dark entity that guided her hand. Whether this was mental illness, religious mania, or something darker is a question that still lingers. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with people desperate to catch a glimpse of the girl who had terrorized their nights. Clementine sat there, calm, composed, almost bored. She pleaded guilty. She admitted to everything. When asked why she did it, she simply reiterated her belief in the sacrifice. She was sentenced to life in prison at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. At the time, she was barely 19 years old. But the story of Clementine Barnabet has one final, unsettling twist. A twist that proves that sometimes the monsters don't die in prison. They just fade back into the crowd. After serving only about 10 years of her life sentence, Clementine Barnabet was released. The reasons are murky. Some say it was due to good behavior. Others say it was a medical release, a procedure she underwent that supposedly cured her of her violent impulses. Whatever the bureaucratic reason, in 1923, the high priestess of the Church of Sacrifice walked out of Angola a free woman. She vanished. There are no records of her death, no grave marker that bears her name, no further arrests. She simply stepped off the pages of history and disappeared into the world. Did she move to a new town? Did she change her name? Did she marry, have children, grow old sitting on a porch somewhere, watching her grandkids play, all while the memories of the axe and the blood played in the back of her mind like a silent movie? Or did she find a new congregation? Did the Church of Sacrifice rise again in some dark corner of America, hidden away from the prying eyes of the law? We don't know. And that uncertainty is perhaps the most terrifying part of her legacy. We like our monsters caught, killed, or caged. We like closure. We like to know that the person who butchered families in their sleep paid the ultimate price. But Clementine Barnabet beat the system. She committed atrocities that would make the devil blush, confessed to them with a smile, and then walked away to live out the rest of her life in anonymity. What makes the case of the voodoo axe murders so deeply disturbing isn't just the body count or the age of the killer. It's the ideology. It's the reminder that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun or an axe. It's a belief. Clementine didn't kill for money or jealousy. She killed because she believed it was righteous. She killed because she thought it made her holy. She looked at a sleeping child, raised an axe, and saw herself as a savior. That level of delusion, that complete inversion of morality, is something you can't reason with. You can't bargain with it. You can only hope you never wake up to find it standing at the foot of your bed. Clementine's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of influence and control. How does a teenage girl convince grown men to commit mass murder? How does a cult of personality form around something so visibly horrific? It speaks to a void in the human psyche, a desperate need for purpose that can be twisted and filled with darkness if the right or wrong person comes along. Clementine was that person. She was a void walker, a shepherd of the damned, leading her flock to salvation one swing of the axe at a time. For decades, the story of the Church of Sacrifice was treated as folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children in Louisiana to make them behave. Be good, or the axe girl will get you. But the graves are real. The police reports are real. The photos of the crime scenes, grainy and black and white, show a reality that no ghost story could ever capture. The blood on the walls was real. The terror in the eyes of the survivors was real. And somewhere, in the lost chapters of American history, the end of Clementine's story is real too. We just don't know what it is. She existed in that liminal space between human and monster, between history and myth. She proved that you don't need to be a towering giant to cast a long shadow. You just need conviction, a charismatic smile, and the will to do what others won't. The axe murders stopped after her arrest. The Church of Sacrifice disbanded, its members scattered or imprisoned. The bayou went back to its normal rhythms, the cicadas, the gators, the heat. But the scar remained, a psychic wound on the landscape that never fully healed. Because even if you catch the killer, you can never unspill the blood. You can never unhear the sound of the axe in the night. And you can never be quite sure, when you lock your door and turn out the light, that you are truly, completely alone. But if you think a cult led by a teenage girl is the peak of depravity, you haven't looked into the eyes of a man who turned his own home into a torture chamber for the sole purpose of hearing women scream. Deep within the coastal lowlands of Ecuador, where the Pacific Ocean bleeds into the continent, lies a labyrinth of twisted roots and stagnant water. The mangroves. It is a place where the earth seems to dissolve into the sea, a landscape of mud and shadow where things can disappear with terrifying ease. In the mid-1980s, the people of Quito and Guayaquil began to whisper about a darkness that had settled over their country. It wasn't a political darkness, though the region had seen its share of unrest. This was something more primal, something that hunted the innocent and left behind only silence. Young girls were vanishing. Not just one or two, but dozens. They were often from poor families, girls who walked to school alone, girls who sold candy on the street corners, girls who were looking for a way out of poverty. They would leave their homes in the morning, their hair brushed, their uniforms pressed, and simply never arrive at their destination. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed them whole. And in a way, it had. Because waiting in the dense, suffocating embrace of the mangroves was a predator who had turned this natural sanctuary into a personal graveyard. A man who would eventually be known as the beast of the mangroves. But to the people who met him, Daniel Camargo Barbosa was anything but a beast. And this is the terrifying paradox that defines the most successful predators. They don't look like monsters. They don't have glowing eyes or sharp teeth, or a sign on their forehead that says danger. Camargo was a man of unremarkable stature, with a soft, almost gentle face. He was articulate, intelligent, and possessed an uncanny ability to make people trust him. He spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who knew things, a man who had traveled, a man who could offer help. When he approached his victims, he didn't use force. He didn't snatch them from the street in a violent struggle that would draw attention. He used words. He used hope. He would approach a young girl, often one who looked lost or destitute, and he would weave a story. Sometimes he was a foreign businessman looking for a maid to work in his wealthy household. Other times, he was a representative of a charity, or even a priest in plain clothes. He knew exactly what these girls needed to hear. He offered them money, employment, a chance to help their families, a chance for a better life. And because they were young, and because they were desperate, and because he was so incredibly convincing, they went with him. They walked willingly into the trap. He would lead them away from the crowded streets, away from the safety of the public eye, and into the secluded, overgrown areas on the outskirts of the city. He would lead them into the mangroves. And it was only there, when the city noise had faded, and the only sound was the buzzing of insects and the lapping of water against the roots, that the mask would slip. To understand how a man becomes a monster capable of such calculated cruelty, we have to look back. We have to peel away the layers of his history and descend into the hell that forged him. Daniel Camargo Barbosa was born in the Colombian Andes in 1930. His story, like so many others in the annals of criminal history, begins with a childhood shattered by trauma. His mother died when he was just an infant, leaving him in the care of a father who was distant and a stepmother who was, by all accounts, sadistic. The abuse he suffered wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. His stepmother, perhaps sensing something broken in the boy, or perhaps simply driven by her own demons, would dress him in girls' clothing. She would force him to wear dresses, to act like a girl, and then humiliate him in front of others. It was a systematic dismantling of his identity, a confusion of gender and power and shame that would fester in his mind for decades. He learned early on that women were sources of pain, figures of authority who used their power to degrade him. And deep in the recesses of his developing brain, a hatred began to take root, a hatred that would eventually blossom into a compulsion to destroy, to dominate, to take back the power that had been stolen from him. But Camargo wasn't just a product of abuse. He was also intellectually gifted. This is what made him truly dangerous. He had an IQ of 116, well above average. He was an avid reader, a student of human nature. He learned how to mimic the behaviors of the upper class, how to adopt different personas. He realized that if you sounded educated and carried yourself with authority, people wouldn't question you. He learned that the world is easily deceived by a suit and a smile. His criminal career began in Colombia, long before he ever set foot in the mangroves of Ecuador. In the 1960s, reports began to surface of a man attacking women in the affluent neighborhoods of Barranquilla. But unlike his later crimes, these weren't just murders. They were exercises in control. He would break into homes, not to steal, but to watch, to terrify. He was eventually caught and sentenced to a long prison term. But the Colombian justice system in the mid-20th century was ill-equipped to handle a mind like Camargo's. He was sent to Gorgona Island. If you haven't heard of Gorgona, imagine a tropical Alcatraz. It was a prison island located some 35 miles off the Pacific coast of Colombia. It was a place of exile, surrounded by shark-infested waters and guarded by the sheer brutality of nature. It was known as the Green Hell. The island was teeming with venomous snakes, fer de lance, coral snakes, vipers. Prisoners slept with their boots on to avoid being bitten. Escape was considered impossible. The currents were deadly, the sharks were plentiful, and the mainland was a distant, hazy dream. But Daniel Camargo Barbosa was not an ordinary prisoner. While other inmates rotted in the humidity, succumbed to disease or lost their minds in the isolation, Camargo was watching. He was studying the currents. He was tracking the movements of the guards. He was analyzing the patterns of the tides. He realized that the impossible was only impossible if you played by the rules of fear. In November 1984, he made his move. It sounds like something out of a movie, a detail that feels too scripted to be real, but it happened. Camargo, a small, unassuming man in his 50s, constructed a flimsy raft out of vines and logs. He waited for a specific festival day when the guards were distracted, likely drunk, and he slipped into the water. He pushed his makeshift vessel into the Pacific Ocean, into the domain of the sharks and the currents. For days, he drifted. The sun beat down on him, blistering his skin. Thirst clawed at his throat. The shadows of sharks glided beneath his feet. Any normal man would have died. He should have died. But Camargo was driven by something stronger than the will to survive. He was driven by the will to hunt. He washed ashore on the coast of Ecuador, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. He had cheated death. He had escaped the green hell. And in doing so, he had unleashed a hell of his own upon the people of Ecuador. He arrived in a new country with a clean slate. No one in Ecuador knew his face. No one knew his history. He was just another drifter, another face in the crowd. But he didn't stay a drifter for long. He reinvented himself. He used his intellect to forge documents, to create a new identity. But more importantly, he began to hunt again. The shift in his modus operandi was subtle but significant. In Colombia, he had been a rapist and a thief. In Ecuador, he became an exterminator. He targeted the most vulnerable, young virgins. In his twisted, delusional mind, he convinced himself that he was doing these girls a favor, or that he was purifying them, or sometimes that he was simply taking revenge on the gender that had tormented him as a child. He sought out purity because he wanted to corrupt it. He wanted to hold the power of life and death in his hands, to watch the light go out in eyes that had moments before looked at him with trust. He settled in Quito, but he traveled. He moved between cities, always staying one step ahead, always blending in. He would frequent the areas around schools, churches, and bus stops. He perfected his pitch. "I am a foreigner," he would say, affecting a slight accent. "I have a lot of money, but I don't know my way around. I need someone to help me carry these packages," or "I am a professor looking for a bright student to help with a project." It is chilling to think about how easy it was for him. We teach our children not to talk to strangers, but we also teach them to be polite, to help others, to respect their elders. Camargo weaponized those virtues. He preyed on the kindness and the obedience of these girls. He would lure them into the jungle, and there the sophisticated gentleman would vanish. The violence he inflicted is difficult to speak of. It was savage. He didn't just kill, he destroyed. And afterward, he would leave their bodies in the mangroves, letting the tides and the mud do the work of concealing his crimes. The ecosystem he chose was perfect for a serial killer. The salt water accelerated decomposition. The scavengers picked the bones clean. The dense root systems made it nearly impossible to find a body unless you tripped over it. For nearly 2 years, he operated with impunity. Families searched in vain. Police were baffled. The media reported on the disappearances, but there were no leads, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just a growing list of names and a city gripped by fear. Parents stopped letting their daughters go out alone. Schools tightened security. But Camargo adapted. He just moved to a different neighborhood, a different town, found a different girl who hadn't heard the warnings. The scale of his operation was staggering. We often think of serial killers as methodical, slow, taking months between victims to cool off. Camargo had no cooling-off period. His hunger was insatiable. In some weeks, he would claim multiple victims. He was a machine of death, operating with a terrifying efficiency. He treated murder like a job, a daily routine. But arrogance is the Achilles heel of every narcissist. And Camargo, for all his intelligence, was a narcissist of the highest order. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than the society he was preying upon. He believed he was untouchable. He had escaped Gorgona. Surely he could outwit the Ecuadorian authorities. It was February 1986 in Quito. A routine police patrol. Nothing special, just officers doing their rounds. They spotted a man acting suspiciously near a school. He looked out of place, a bit too interested in the young girls walking by. They stopped him. It was a moment that hung on a razor's edge. If he had remained calm, if he had used his silver tongue, he might have talked his way out of it. He had done it before, but when they checked his bag, they found items that didn't make sense. Little things, trinkets, and then they checked his identification. It was fake, but not fake enough. The officers, perhaps sensing something wrong, perhaps remembering the descriptions of the foreigner that had been circulating in rumors, decided to take him in. At the station, the unraveling began. At first, Camargo was defiant. He played the role of the indignant, innocent man. But investigators began to press. They noticed inconsistencies. And then news arrived from Colombia. The fingerprints matched. This wasn't just a creep hanging around a school. This was Daniel Camargo, Barbosa, the escapee from Gorgona, the sadist of Charquito. The realization in the room must have been electric. They had a monster in custody, but they had no idea of the magnitude of the monster they were holding. They thought they had caught a rapist, maybe a murderer of one or two. They were not prepared for what Camargo was about to tell them. In a move that shocked everyone, Camargo didn't lawyer up. He didn't stay silent. Once his identity was revealed, he seemed to relish the attention. He wanted credit. He wanted the world to know what he had done. He began to confess, and he didn't stop. He told them about the girls. He told them about the mangroves. He told them about the specific lies he used. He led police on a tour of horror through the outskirts of Quito and Guayaquil. He walked them into the jungle and pointed to spots in the mud. "Dig here," he would say. And they would dig, and they would find bones. "And here," say, and they would find scraps of a school uniform. The numbers kept climbing, 10, 20, 30. The police were overwhelmed. They ran out of body bags. They ran out of resources to process the scenes. Camargo guided them with a sickening calmness, remembering details about each victim, not their names. He didn't care about their names, but how he had tricked them, how they had reacted. He viewed his crimes as accomplishments. When the dust settled, Daniel Camargo Barbosa confessed to murdering 71 girls in Ecuador. 71. But that was just the number he admitted to, the number he could remember or be bothered to point out. Investigators believe the true number was much higher. Some estimates put his victim count over 150. When you add in his crimes in Colombia before his imprisonment, he stands as one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. This was a man who had killed more people than Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy combined, and he had done it in a fraction of the time, largely unnoticed by the wider world. The revelation sent shockwaves through South America. People couldn't comprehend it. How could one man do so much damage? How could he operate for so long? In interviews from prison, Camargo was chillingly remorseless. He sat with journalists, his face calm, his voice steady, and explained his philosophy. He blamed his stepmother. He blamed society. He blamed the women themselves for being too trusting. He took no responsibility for the moral weight of his actions. He spoke of murder as if he were discussing the weather. He was the embodiment of the banality of evil, a quiet, polite man who happened to be a voracious predator. His incarceration brought a sense of relief, but also a lingering horror. He was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time, 16 years. It seemed like a sick joke. 16 years for 71 lives, a few months for each girl he murdered. The public was outraged. The families of the victims were devastated. The limitations of the legal system felt like a final insult to the memories of the dead. But prison has its own form of justice. It is a closed ecosystem, violent and unforgiving, much like the mangroves Camargo loved so much. In prison, he was a celebrity of the darkest kind, but he was also a target. Inmates have a hierarchy, and while killers are often at the top, those who prey on children and young girls occupy the lowest rung. On November 13, 1994, Daniel Camargo Barbosa's luck finally ran out. He was in his cell at the Garcia Moreno prison in Quito. It was a place known for its brutality, a concrete box filled with the worst offenders in the country. Camargo was 64 years old. He probably thought he would serve his time, maybe even get out early for good behavior and disappear again. He was still plotting, still manipulating, still believing he was the smartest man in the room. But he didn't see it coming. A fellow inmate, the cousin of one of Camargo's victims, had been waiting. He had been watching, just as Camargo had watched the guards on Gorgona. This inmate, a man named Giovanni Noguera, approached Camargo. There were no words of deception this time, no clever stories about being a foreigner or a priest, just the cold, hard reality of a blade. Noguera stabbed Camargo repeatedly. It was a brutal, frenzied attack. The beast of the mangroves, the man who had terrified a nation, who had escaped the green hell, who had murdered over 100 women, bled out on the dirty floor of a prison cell. He died alone, in pain, and without dignity, exactly the way he had left so many of his victims. There is no happy ending to this story. Camargo's death didn't bring the girls back. It didn't heal the families who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters, only to find out they had been discarded in the mud. It didn't erase the fear that had taken root in the communities he stalked. But his story forces us to confront a terrifying reality. We like to think that we can spot danger. We tell ourselves that we would know a killer if we saw one, that our instincts would kick in, that we would run. But Daniel Camargo Barbosa proves us wrong. He proves that evil doesn't always scowl. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it offers you a job. Sometimes it looks like a confused tourist asking for directions. He was a man who exploited the very best parts of human nature, our willingness to help, our trust, our hope, and used them as weapons. He turned the social contract against his victims. And that is perhaps the most demonic thing about him. He didn't just kill their bodies, he betrayed their humanity before he ended it. The beast of the mangroves is gone, his bones likely rotting in an unmarked grave, much like the ones he dug for his victims. But the silence he left behind in the jungles of Ecuador still hangs heavy in the air, a reminder that in the shadowed places of the world, monsters are real, and sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monster hiding in the dark. It's the nice man standing in the light, holding out his hand, asking for help. And while Camargo's reign of terror was defined by the sheer volume of his victims, our next subject is defined by the sheer brutality of his methods. We move now from the humid jungles of South America to the freezing, desolate landscapes of Siberia. Imagine a chessboard, 64 squares, a game of logic, strategy, and patience. Now imagine a man who decided that for every square on that board, a life had to be taken. A man who turned a game of kings into a contest of slaughter. This is the story of the chessboard killer. And if you thought the mangroves were dark, you haven't seen anything yet. Alexander Pichushkin didn't hunt in the shadows of a jungle. He hunted in a public park in the middle of Moscow. He didn't hide from society. He invited it to play a game with him. And the prize for winning? You got to live. But nobody ever won against Alexander. Born in Mytishchi, Moscow Oblast, in 1974, Pichushkin seemed like a normal child until a swing accident damaged his frontal cortex. It's a detail that neurologists and psychologists debate to this day. Did a playground accident create a serial killer? Or was the darkness always there, waiting for a crack in the skull to let it out? But before we dive into the mind of the chessboard killer, we have to understand the world he lived in. A world of collapsing empires, vodka-soaked despair, and a park called Bitsa. Bitsa Park is a massive forest within Moscow, a place where people go to walk their dogs, to drink, to escape the crushing greyness of the city. It was Pichushkin's living room, and it was about to become his slaughterhouse. The scale of Camargo's crimes was hidden by the wilderness, but Pichushkin wanted his crimes to be seen. He wanted to fill that chessboard. He wanted to beat the record of another famous Russian killer, Andrei Chikatilo. It wasn't just murder for him. It was a competition, a sport, and the most terrifying part, he almost finished the game. So how does a man walk into a public park with a hammer and a bottle of vodka and murder dozens of people without anyone noticing? How does he convince them to walk with him into the trees? And why, when they finally caught him, did he look at the camera and smile, claiming that killing was as necessary to him as breathing? To answer that, we have to step onto the board. We have to look into the eyes of a man who didn't see people as human beings, but as pawns to be removed from play. The game is about to begin, and in this game, checkmate means death. But before we make that first move, we need to understand the trigger, the moment the switch flipped, because for Alexander Pichushkin, the urge to kill didn't start with a stranger in the park. It started much closer to home. It started with a betrayal that taught him a lesson he would never forget. People are disposable. The year is 1992. The Soviet Union has just fallen. The world is in chaos. And an 18-year-old boy is about to commit his first murder. Not for pleasure, not yet, but out of a twisted sense of partnership. He had a friend, a classmate named Mikhail Odichuk. They shared a dark fascination. They talked about killing. They planned it. They were going to be a team, a deadly duo who would cleanse the city of its trash. But when the moment of truth came, Mikhail hesitated. He got cold feet. He didn't have the stomach for it. And in that moment, Pichushkin realized something. He didn't need a partner. A partner was a weakness. A partner was a liability. So he made a decision. Mikhail wouldn't be his accomplice. Mikhail would be his first square on the board. He invited Mikhail to the park. They brought vodka. They talked about their plans. And then Pichushkin struck. He killed his best friend, his only friend, and dumped his body in a well. It was a test, an initiation. And when he walked away, he didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel remorse. He felt powerful. He felt like a god. For years, that well in Bitsa Park would become his signature. He called it the sewer to hell. He would lure his victims, often older men, homeless men, people he drank with, to the edge of the well, He would get them drunk, listen to their stories, share a moment of human connection. And then, when they were groggy and vulnerable, he would smash their heads with a hammer and push them in. It was a ritual, a cleansing. He believed he was taking their souls. He claimed that with every person he killed, he added their life to his own. He was becoming infinite. And the police? They were nowhere. The victims were undesirables, people society had already forgotten. Just like with Camargo, Pichushkin exploited the apathy of the system. He knew that a missing drunk wouldn't make the front page. But as the chessboard began to fill up, Pichushkin got bored. The drunks were too easy. They didn't fight back. They didn't beg. He wanted a challenge. He wanted to see fear. So he changed his target. He started going after women, children, people who were sober, people who would understand what was happening to them. He stopped hiding the bodies in the well. He started leaving them in the open. He wanted them to be found. He wanted the city to know he was there. He put a stick in the open wounds of his victims, a signature so grotesque it baffled investigators. Was it a symbol, a taunt, or just the madness of a man who had lost all touch with reality? The city of Moscow began to panic. They called him the Bitzer maniac. People stopped going to the park. But Pichushkin didn't stop. He was on a schedule. He had squares to fill, 61, 62, 63. He was closing in on the end of the game. But like all games, this one had to end. And it ended because of a simple ticket. A metro ticket found in the pocket of a victim. A victim who had left a note at home saying she was going for a walk with her co-worker, Alexander. When police raided his apartment, they found the chessboard. They found the dates written on the squares. They found the hammer. And they found a man who was disappointed. Not that he was caught, but that they had stopped him before he could finish the board. "I haven't killed 49, he told the police, correcting their count with a sneer. "I've killed 60, maybe more. I lost count. I didn't buy a calendar." Alexander Pichushkin sits in a glass cage today, staring out at the world with dead eyes. He is a reminder that the line between a man and a monster is thinner than we think. A swing accident, a sip of vodka, a game of chess. The board is closed now. The pieces are put away. But the game never really ends. It just waits for the next player to sit down. In the sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of Lahore, Pakistan, life moves at a pace that can feel overwhelming to an outsider. It is a city of ancient history and modern struggle, where the call to prayer mingles with the roar of traffic, and millions of people fight daily for survival in the sweltering heat. In the late 1990s, amidst this dense fog of humanity, there existed a population that was visible to everyone, yet seen by no one. They were the street children, runaways, orphans, boys working for pennies to feed families that had long since crumbled under the weight of poverty. They slept on the steps of the Data Darbar shrine. They scavenged in the markets, and they learned early that the world was a hard, unforgiving place. To the average passerby, they were part of the background noise of the city, tragic but inevitable fixtures of the urban landscape. But to one man, they were something else entirely. They were raw materials. We often tell ourselves that if a monster were operating in our midst, we would know. We believe that evil on a massive scale leaves a footprint too deep to ignore, that the disappearance of innocent lives would trigger alarms, mobilize police, and send waves of panic through the community. But what happens when the victims are the ones society has already decided to forget? What happens when the predator understands that the value of a human life is unfortunately determined by who is asking for it to be saved? In 1999, Lahore was about to learn a lesson that would stain its history forever. A lesson about apathy, about the invisibility of the poor, and about a darkness so profound it would force an entire nation to look in the mirror and recoil at what it saw. For months, perhaps even years, a silence had been spreading through the lower rungs of Lahore's society. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Mothers in impoverished neighborhoods were waking up to empty beds. Fathers were searching the streets for sons who had gone out to find work and never returned. Families were going to police stations, clutching crinkled photographs of smiling boys, begging for help, pleading for someone to listen. But the system was deaf. In a city of millions, a missing poor boy is often written off as a runaway, a statistic, a child who simply chose to leave. The police dismissed the parents. They told them their sons would come back when they got hungry, or that they had likely gone to another city to find better luck. The files weren't opened. The connections weren't made. The pattern was ignored because acknowledging it would require caring about the victims. And while the police sat behind their desks and the city moved on, a house in the Chessboard neighborhood was becoming a factory of death. It was a modest place, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of structure that blends seamlessly into the concrete sprawl of a working-class district. Neighbors heard noises, sure. They smelled strange odors, chemical and acrid, wafting over the walls in the heavy night air. But in a crowded city, you learn to mind your own business. You learn not to ask questions that might bring trouble to your own door. And so, the man inside continued his work, undisturbed, protected by the very indifference that allowed him to hunt. But monsters, especially the humankind, are often driven by an ego that eventually outweighs their instinct for self-preservation. They don't just want to kill, they want to be known. They want the world to see their work, to marvel at their capability, to feel the fear that they have been meticulously cultivating in the dark. For the killer in Lahore, the silence of the police became an insult. He hadn't just killed one or two. He hadn't just committed a crime. He had committed an atrocity of biblical proportions, and the fact that no one had caught him, that no one was even looking for him, seemed to offend his sense of accomplishment. On December 30th, 1999, the curtain was finally pulled back, not by a brilliant detective or a lucky break in an investigation, but by the killer himself. He walked into the office of a local newspaper and handed over a letter. He also sent a similar package to the police. It wasn't a frantic scribbled note of a madman. It was a confession, detailed, precise, and horrifyingly calm. The man's name was Javed Iqbal, and what he had written on those pages would freeze the blood of anyone who read it. He didn't claim to have killed 5 boys, or 10, or even 20. Javed Iqbal claimed that he had raped and murdered 100 children. The number alone was staggering. It was incomprehensible. Serial killers who reach triple digits are almost unheard of in modern history. They are statistical anomalies, nightmares that aren't supposed to exist in the real world. At first, there was skepticism. How could one man kill 100 boys in a crowded city without anyone noticing? It sounded like a fabrication, a dark fantasy from a disturbed mind seeking attention. But Iqbal hadn't just given a number. He had given instructions. He told the police exactly where to go. He told them to go to his house in Chessboard. He told them that the evidence of his work was waiting for them, preserved and catalogued, as if he were a librarian of death. When the police finally raided the house on Ravi Road, the skepticism evaporated instantly, replaced by a horror so visceral that seasoned officers reportedly vomited at the scene. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with a stench that no amount of ventilation could clear. It was the smell of chemicals and decay, a miasma that clung to the clothes and skin of everyone who entered. And there, just as Iqbal had promised, was the proof. In the courtyard and inside the rooms, investigators found large blue plastic vats. They were the kind of industrial drums used for storing chemicals. But when the officers looked inside, they didn't find industrial solvents. They found acid. And in that acid, they found the partially dissolved remains of human beings. Iqbal had developed a method of disposal that was as efficient as it was demonic. After strangling his victims, he would dismember them and submerge the body parts in hydrochloric acid, waiting until bone and flesh liquefied into a sludge that could be poured down the drains. He was erasing them, literally washing them out of existence, turning these forgotten children into nothing more than waste in the city's sewer system. But the vats were just the beginning of the nightmare inside that house. As police moved through the rooms, they found that Iqbal was a hoarder of memories. He hadn't just wanted to kill these boys, he had wanted to keep them. On the walls, on the floor, in stacks and piles, were the clothes of the victims. Small shirts, worn-out trousers, sandals that had walked miles on the hot pavement of Lahore. Each item was a testament to a life cut short, a tangible remnant of a boy who had once laughed and cried and dreamed. And then there were the photos. Iqbal had taken pictures of many of his victims, capturing them in their final days or moments. He had kept a diary, a ledger of death, where he recorded the details of each murder, names, ages, dates, the cost of the acid used to destroy them. He had treated the annihilation of 100 lives with the meticulous bookkeeping of a small business owner. The police found evidence of exactly 100 victims, not 99, not 101. Iqbal had stopped at precisely 100. In his letter, he stated that he had fulfilled his vow. He claimed that he had been driven by a desire for revenge against the police and the society that had wronged him. Years earlier, he had been arrested for a crime he claimed he didn't commit, sodomy against a young boy. He said the police had beaten him, humiliated him, and destroyed his life. His mother had been forced to watch his degradation, and he claimed her subsequent death was caused by the trauma. So in a twisted, labyrinthine logic that only a psychopath could construct, he decided to make the mothers of Lahore cry the way his mother had cried. He decided to punish the society that had failed him by destroying its most vulnerable future. The media storm that followed was unprecedented. Pakistan, a conservative nation, was rocked to its core. The details were too graphic for many newspapers to print, yet everyone knew. The Lahore child killer became a moniker that carried the weight of a national trauma. Parents gripped their children tighter. The streets emptied out after dark. The indifference that had allowed Iqbal to operate was replaced by a collective hysteria and a burning, white-hot rage. People demanded justice. They demanded blood. Iqbal, strangely, had vanished after delivering his confession. For a few days, the most wanted man in Pakistan was a ghost. A massive manhunt was launched. The police, finally mobilized by shame and public pressure, scoured the country. But Iqbal wasn't running. He was waiting. In a final act of theatrical defiance, he walked into the office of a newspaper in Lahore on December 30th, exactly as he had planned, and surrendered. He told the journalists he could have kept killing. He told them he could have reached 500 if he wanted to. But he had promised himself 100, and he was a man of his word. He surrendered not because he was cornered, but because he was finished. The interrogation and subsequent trial offered a glimpse into a mind completely devoid of empathy. Iqbal spoke of his crimes with a chilling detachment. He described how he lured the boys, often runaways at the Data Darbar shrine or the railway station, with promises of food, a place to sleep, or a few rupees for simple work. These were children who were starving, exhausted, and desperate for any kindness. They walked willingly into his house because he offered them the basic necessities that society had denied them. He fed them, he let them watch TV, he gained their trust, and then, when their guard was down, he drugged them. He utilized a chain for strangulation, a method that was intimate and brutal. He recounted the details without a flicker of remorse. To him, the boys were not human beings. They were symbols, props in his grand stage play of revenge. He admitted to the sexual abuse, the murders, the disposal. He admitted to everything. He even seemed proud of the efficiency of his acid technique, explaining the ratios and the time it took to dissolve a body completely. It was a masterclass in psychopathy, a demonstration of what happens when a human being shuts off the part of the brain that connects us to one another. But the horror of the Javed Iqbal case isn't just in the mechanics of the killing. It's in the realization of what those 100 piles of clothes represented. Each shirt was a boy who had a name. There was Niaz, who wanted to be a cricketer. There was Sohail, who had run away from home after a fight with his father and was just trying to find a way back. There were brothers who tried to protect each other. 100 universes extinguished in a small house on Ravi Road, while the neighbors complained about the smell and the police drank tea in their stations, ignoring the weeping parents at their gates. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession, the diary, the photos, the vat of acid, the clothes. On March 16, 2000, the judge handed down a sentence that was as medieval as the crime itself. In a courtroom packed with the families of the victims, the judge declared that Javed Iqbal should be strangled to death with the same chain he used on his victims. But that wasn't enough. The judge ordered that his body should be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid in front of the parents of the children he had killed. It was a verdict driven by pure retributive fury, a biblical eye for an eye that echoed the public's thirst for vengeance. The sentence made international headlines. Human rights organizations protested, citing the cruelty of the punishment. The execution became a subject of debate, a collision between modern law and primal justice. But the debate would ultimately be moot. On October 8, 2001, before the sentence could be carried out, Javed Iqbal and his accomplice were found dead in their prison cells. The official report stated that they had committed suicide by taking poison. It was a convenient end to a sordid chapter. Many in Pakistan believed they were murdered, silenced to prevent further embarrassment to the police force whose incompetence had been so publicly exposed. Others believed the police simply facilitated the suicide to save the state the trouble of a gruesome execution. Regardless of how he died, Javed Iqbal escaped the physical torture that had been decreed for him. But he left behind a legacy that continues to haunt Lahore. The house on Ravi Road was eventually demolished, the physical structure erased just as Iqbal had tried to erase the boys. But the memory remains. The case forced a reckoning regarding the treatment of street children in Pakistan, though how much actually changed is a matter of debate. It exposed the rot in a system that protects the powerful and ignores the weak. When we look at the story of Javed Iqbal, we are forced to confront a terrifying reality about the nature of serial killers. We like to think of them as hunters who stalk us from the shadows, clever and elusive. But Iqbal wasn't a genius. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who operated in the open, in a crowded neighborhood, using a method that produced noxious fumes and noticeable evidence. He got away with it for so long, not because he was invisible, but because he chose victims that society had decided weren't worth looking for. He exploited the blind spot of a city's conscience. The true horror of the Javed Iqbal letter wasn't just the confession of 100 murders. It was the arrogance of the delivery. It was the fact that he had to tell the police what he had done because they were too incompetent to figure it out themselves. He had to hand-deliver the solution to the mystery because the mystery hadn't even registered as a priority. He controlled the narrative from the beginning to the end. He decided when the killing started, he decided who would die, and he decided when it would stop, and in the end, he even decided how he would leave the world, denying the families the spectacle of justice they had been promised. The piles of tiny shoes found in his home remain one of the most enduring and heartbreaking images of criminal history. Shoes that would never walk again, waiting for owners who had been dissolved into the drains of Lahore. It serves as a grim reminder that while we fear the monster under the bed, the real danger often comes from the monster who knows exactly who we are willing to ignore. The 100 boys of Lahore didn't just die by the hands of Javed Iqbal. They died by the negligence of a world that failed to see them until it was too late. But sometimes, the monster isn't a stranger lurking in the dark or a man with a vendetta against society. Sometimes, the danger is much closer to home. Sometimes, the person you should fear most is the one sitting across from you at the dinner table, the one who shares your name, your blood, and your secrets. Because while Javed Iqbal hunted strangers in the streets, our next subject found his victims in the sanctuary of his own family tree, proving that the most dangerous place on earth can be your own living room. When we step back and look at the tapestry of horror woven by men like Michael Swango, Donald Leroy Evans, Herbert Baumeister, Robert Schulman, and the phantom bouncing ball killer, the picture that emerges is not one of supernatural evil, but of terrifyingly ordinary camouflage. We want to believe that monsters look like monsters. We want to believe that if we stood next to a man who had strangled a dozen people, the hair on our arms would stand up, that some primal instinct would scream at us to run. But the lesson these obscure cases teach us, the lesson that is far harder to swallow than any fiction, is that the monsters look exactly like us. They are the doctors checking your vitals, the mail carriers walking up your driveway, the successful business owners hosting pool parties in affluent suburbs. The common thread binding these disparate predators isn't just their brutality. It is their ability to exploit the blind spots of society. They didn't hunt in the shadows. They hunted in the glare of our own apathy and trust. Michael Swango weaponized the white coat, using the universal trust we place in medicine to turn hospitals into slaughterhouses. Robert Schulman used the invisibility of the working class, the uniform that makes a man a fixture of the neighborhood rather than a suspect. Herbert Baumeister used the shield of wealth and the nuclear family to hide a graveyard in his own backyard. They understood that as long as they maintained the performance of normalcy, as long as they showed up to work, paid their taxes, and smiled at the right moments, no one would look in their basements. No one would check the trunk of the blue Cadillac. Furthermore, these cases expose a systemic failure that is as enraged as it is tragic. These killers thrived on opportunity, targeting the people society had already decided to overlook. The elderly, the homeless, the sex workers, the runaways, the marginalized members of the gay community in the 90s. They chose victims whose disappearances would be met with a shrug rather than a siren. It was a calculated predation, a realization that the system has cracks, and if you shove a body deep enough into those cracks, it might never be found. It wasn't genius that kept them free for so long. It was our own collective failure to value every life equally. They were fueled by a pure, unadulterated sadism, a need not just to kill, but to possess, to control, to extinguish a light simply because they had the power to do so. But here is the most disturbing thought of all, the one that should linger with you long after the screen goes dark. We know about Swango, Evans, Burmeister, and Schulman because they made mistakes. They got sloppy. They left a witness. They kept a trophy. They let their mast slip just an inch too far. They are the ones who failed at being monsters. But statistics from the FBI suggest that at any given moment, there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers operating in the United States alone. Men and women who are currently hunting, currently hiding, and currently winning. They are the ones who haven't made a mistake yet. They are the ones whose neighbors still think they are just quiet, polite people who keep to themselves. This reality forces us to confront an even darker question. If these are the stories of the killers we eventually caught, what about the stories that have no ending? What about the predators who are so meticulous, so disciplined, and so devoid of human connection that they never leave a trace? The bouncing ball eventually stopped in Los Angeles, but for every ball that stops, there is another that keeps bouncing in the silence of an unsolved case file. Understanding the psychology of the men we caught is only the first step in protecting yourself. To truly understand the depth of this abyss, you have to look at the cases where the system failed completely, where the clues led nowhere, and the killer simply vanished into the mist, free to live out their life while their victims rot in the ground. The only thing more terrifying than a monster you can name is a monster you can't. That is why the next step in this journey is crucial. You need to understand the methods of the predators who were never identified, the ones who beat the system entirely. Click the video on your screen right now, titled Serial Killers Who Were Never Caught, The Ones That Got Away. It uncovers the chilling reality of the perfect crimes that are still haunting detectives today, and it might just change the way you look at the stranger passing you on the street. I'll see you in there.